All right, let's go ahead and move on to a lot that is unfolding in Israel right now. I can put this up on the screen. We have Bibi once again, and to get back to U.S. humiliation, snubbing the U.S., which is claimed to want them to wrap up their assault on Gaza kind of soon, and say, you know what, actually, this war against Hamas, it's set to continue at least into 2025. He reportedly told local council chiefs from communities near Gaza on Tuesday he anticipates the war against Hamas extending into 2025. According to an unsourced Channel 12 report on the meeting, which was held at the IDF's Southern Command headquarters and attended by other security cabinet ministers, Netanyahu told the council chiefs that according to the current assessment, the war may continue into next year. I'm going to get in a moment into the psychology of not only Bibi, who we focused on before, his incentives in keeping this thing going forever and potentially expanding this thing, even more aggressively into at least a northern front, potentially drawing in Iran as well. But if you look at the entirety of the war cabinet and the defense establishment, they all have a lot of interest in keeping this war going. So I don't want anybody to get it into their head that it's just like one bad apple who wants this to go on forever and has incentives, personal political incentives tied to his own ambitions to hold on to his power, that has an interest in keeping this thing going. Basically, all of the leadership share very similar interests in that regard. At the same time, Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken were at the World Economic Forum in Davos, spinning their version of what they would like to see, supposedly, in the quote-unquote day after in Gaza. And they continue to push for a two-state solution, something I certainly support. I think the only resolution to this conflict is not a military resolution. It is a diplomatic resolution that results in Palestinians having actual statehood and actual rights and dignity. They claim to support that. Let's take a listen to what they had to say.
We seek to stop the spread of conflict and to create the conditions for de-escalation. Our approach is and remains focused on moving towards greater integration and stability in the region. Long before October 7th, the United States was deeply engaged in an effort to secure a political horizon for the Palestinian people, with Israel's security guaranteed as part of that.
So listen, that's all well and good, except, he's lying when he says that we were doing anything to try to push for Palestinian statehood before October 7th. We'd completely thrown them under the bus in this attempt at normalization with Saudi Arabia. But the other problem, Saagar, is this is utter and complete fantasy. The only way you're going to have any sort of a two-state solution at this point is if the U.S. basically forces it, like is really actually willing, and I think we could theoretically do this, to use our muscle and to use the points of leverage that we have to force this outcome in spite of the fact that this is not what the Israelis want. And I'm not just talking about Netanyahu, who is out there bragging about how he has thwarted a two-state solution for years now and that he is your guy to guarantee there will never be a Palestinian state, but Israelis are, by and large, the population not interested in a two-state solution. Put this up on the screen. This was prior to October 7th. The numbers that I've seen post-October 7th are actually very similar to where this stands, which is only 32% of Jewish Israelis and 35% of the Israeli public overall believe that you could have an independent Palestine that could coexist peacefully. And that's why you hear Netanyahu out there campaigning effectively to keep his job based on a promise that he will guarantee this never, ever happens. So it would be one thing, Saagar, if the U.S. had shown any willingness to use the points of leverage they had to obtain this outcome. But if you're just going to go out there at Davos and pretend like there's some fantasy world out there that exists that doesn't actually exist, and you are not willing to use any sort of power to try to create that reality you claim to support, like you're just a liar and a fraud at that point.
The problem I think that they really have here is that everyone in the international system is pretending otherwise. So I was reading earlier today, the Saudi Arabians and the UAE are like, we must have Palestinian statehood. And it's like, okay, well, like, what are you going to do about it? And then the Israelis are like, well, we don't really want Palestinian statehood. And in America, it's like, well, we do want Palestinian statehood, but we're not necessarily going to do anything. Like you said, I think we may be able to force them, but honestly, I don't know. Their political system is so screwed up and their democratic incentives are such that they may honestly favor either a break of relations or like really daring us to actually break off. And I think they would win in a standoff, Krystal, like in a standoff with our political system. As in, Americans would break first in terms of like, no, Israel, like, don't go. We're not really going to do anything. We promise. Whereas I think the Israelis, I mean, at least for where their population is and all of that, they could certainly walk considering where things are trending in that direction.
That's obviously true because there's not even willingness to even try. So,
but I'm saying, even if we did, I think they would win.
There's no way. I mean, we're not even willing to even try. This is all fantasy. These people are smart enough. Like Jake Sullivan is not an idiot. For all of the issues I have with him, Tony Blinken also. These are not stupid people. They know the reality of who, not only Netanyahu, but the entire, the war cabinet and where Israeli public opinion. They know all of this. They know that the settlements that have been allowed to expand under every single Israeli prime minister, not just Benjamin Netanyahu, Obama, every single one, okay? Those settlements make it almost impossible, and that's the goal of the settlements, to have any sort of a two-state solution. They know that Netanyahu made this cynical deal of, I'm going to prop up Hamas because they're a useful foil for me, and I'm going to keep the West Bank and the Gaza Strip separated, and I'm going to use Hamas to say, look, we don't have a partner. They know all of this, but they are willing to go out there and lie and create some fantasy situation and potential solution that they are not in any way willing to actually back up and push for. To get back to what I was saying about Bibi and his interest in forever war, which is shared by the war cabinet. This was a fantastic piece that laid out the calculus here from Haaretz. Go ahead and put this up on the screen. The headline is Why Israel's Political and Military Leaders Want a Perpetual War. Many of the country's decision makers appear enamored of a situation in which the Israel war, Hamas war, continues with no end in sight. This is why it could benefit them. And he goes through piece by piece, member by member, and says this is their calculus. This is why it's in their interest to keep this thing going forever. He starts with this quote. Could keep this up on the screen because we've got the quote there. The war has become the objective. Think about that. Just the war itself has become the goal. Former Shin Bet Security Agency Director Ami Aylan told me in a recent Haaretz interview the statement attracted wide attention in Israel and around the world. Because think of what an admission that is. No, we're not trying to take on Hamas. No, we're not really trying to accomplish, security for our people. All we want is war. That's the whole goal, is war, to keep the war going forever. Not because it served the interests of certainly not the Palestinians, certainly not the Israeli public, because it serves their own political interest to keep this thing going. So as one example here to see the way that this thinking plays out, Benny Gantz, who is supposedly, oppositional to Netanyahu, who joined the war cabinet as a show of unity in the wake of October 7th, he writes, Gantz seems to be basking in success in the polls, concerned he would lose his high rating in the polls if he quits the government. From that perspective, there's little difference between him and Netanyahu in their management of the war. The decisions of both are motivated by personal and political considerations. In addition, keep in mind, it's not just Netanyahu and his policy that failed on October 7th. It was also the entire defense, security, intel establishment. So people like Yoav Gallant, who again had been at odds with Netanyahu over the judicial coup situation, he shares in that failure on October 7th of preventing and then responding to those attacks. So he also has an interest in keeping this thing going as long as possible to avoid the questions and the scrutiny that will come of what the hell happened that enabled this all to unfold. They also believe that the more fighting they do, decimate Gaza, okay, then we'll move on to Hezbollah and wherever else beyond, that they can then bring home more supposed victories to the people, and maybe that'll bolster their political standing. And let's be honest, for them also, it's not like what's happened in Gaza has gone all that well for them. They have not destroyed Hamas. They have not come even close to destroying Hamas. They have not destroyed the tunnel system. They haven't even been able to, they have not been able to free the hostages. The only time hostages were being freed was from through a ceasefire, which they all oppose because they want this thing to go on forever. They killed 3 of their own hostages. That's more than they were able to rescue. And top Hamas leadership remains at large within the Gaza Strip. So they have not accomplished anything close to the impossible goals that they set out at the beginning of this which were never really the real goals, and have every interest in keeping this thing going and expanding it even further.
Well, the expansion actually, one of the things that we've been looking and wanted to flag for all of you. Can we put D6, please, up on the screen? It's about the Wall Street Journal. They say Israel's war in Gaza is entering its most perilous phase yet. Military is aiming to take control of the maze of tunnels under Khan Yunis as refugees crowd into the south and international outcry grows over the death toll. The reason that they put it that way is that obviously there's no more shelter in Gaza, so it's not like you can tell people to leave. But the tunnel network that is in the tunnel network from the Egyptian border is the one that the Israelis had the least amount of visibility in, and brings them not only in contact with the vast majority of whatever's left of the civilian populace, but more and more likely of a mistake and a perilous step over the border with Egypt, because Egypt has their military all right there at the Rafah crossing. They're very sensitive and have been previously to any military incursion or any change to the Egyptian status quo. That all goes back to the peace agreements. Already both are technically in violation of some of the Sinai agreements, but this could make it so that if the Israelis do cross the border, if there's one wrong strike, or which we've previously seen in the past, could dramatically escalate tensions, not to mention the civilian problems, and also because Rafah is the main way which humanitarian aid has been going through, which we know that there's a new deal on, but this could even imperil that, because if you destroy the infrastructure, there's nowhere to even move anything through.
Yeah, well, Egypt is extremely pissed at Israel for a variety of reasons, but in particular because Israel tried to throw them under the bus at the International Court of Justice and claimed they were the reason that Palestinians were not receiving anywhere close to sufficient aid, and why half of the population of the Gaza Strip is starving right now, and disease spreading rampantly, and no wildly inadequate medical supplies, amputations happening on children without anesthetic. They tried to blame Egypt for that. Egypt was so pissed off that they're now submitting their own filings disputing that Israeli report to the ICJ to rebut those, scurrilous claims that were made. And, so at the same time as you have all of this interest in the direction of forever war, Israel is really making themselves into a global pariah, to the extent that, of course, they had charges filed against them at the ICJ claiming that they violated the Genocide Convention. And the very latest that we can show you with regard to that, they claim, we didn't bomb any hospitals. That's part of what the claims that they made at the ICJ. Well, we have another hospital reportedly, put this up on the screen, Al Nasser Hospital. This is in southern Gaza, I believe near Khan Yunis, that multiple news organizations have reported is now under attack. You can see there were thousands of Palestinians who had been displaced who were sheltering there, not to mention that, many of the hospitals across the Gaza Strip are now completely, wholly or partially incapacitated. So this is one of the few places that still remained and was treating patients to the best of their ability, given the woeful inadequacy of medical supplies. So you see people fleeing now from that hospital. And, the toll here is unbelievable. You referenced, Saagar, there was a deal. We can put the D7 up on the screen here. There was some sort of a deal that was struck for additional medical aid in particular. This was in Qatar. They say Hamas and Israeli forces have negotiated an agreement to bring aid to Gaza. The Qatari Foreign Ministry said the deal, arranged in cooperation with France, will see medicine and other humanitarian aid delivered to civilians in the most affected and vulnerable areas of Gaza, I think northern Gaza in particular. In exchange, this is why the Israelis agreed to it, for the delivery of medication to Israeli captives held in Gaza. The ministry's spokesperson said that the medication and aid would leave Doha on Wednesday to Egypt before being transported into Gaza. This has actually sparked also a whole domestic dispute within Israel, because there was question over whether the Israelis were going to inspect this aid before it goes in or not. It seemed like the agreement said no, and then Netanyahu claimed yes. And in any case, there was a whole additional divide over this. But the fact that you need additional aid going in is kind of an admission that what has been going in has been wildly inadequate, to the extent that, the hostages who the Hamas has every interest in keeping alive and keeping well were not getting sufficient care.
Yeah, it's really interesting just to look at this whole thing, because, it's like things are moving in a bunch of different directions. You've got the hostage situation, which remains completely unresolved, the humanitarian situation, the military one on top of that, and then Israeli domestic politics. So we have this we can put up there on on the screen, the Israeli Labor Party actually issued a no confidence vote, which kind of calls into question the current coalition which is governing Israel. That was a no confidence vote against Netanyahu, challenging his approach. Now, this would be like if the Labor Party in Britain during the coalition wartime government of Winston Churchill had a no confidence vote against his leadership, which really called into the entire idea of like a bipartisan war and that. Now, let's be clear, it's not like the Labor Party is against the war per se, but they are very much against Netanyahu. I mean, in my opinion, it wouldn't be a bad outcome for them to be a new prime minister just to give them some better legitimacy in terms of their own population. They need to have an election so they can decide what they want to do. Because right now you're being ruled by the guy who was basically all of this is his fault. And every incentive he has, as you laid out, is to keep this thing going on as long as possible. Now, if the Israelis want war with Lebanon, okay, go for it. You guys can sign up. Hopefully you'll pay for it and you can do all of it yourself. Yeah. But, it's like you should have some sort of say and vote over that. I'm kind of shocked there isn't more of a pressure inside society. Yeah. Maybe the hostage thing just takes, I'm not there. It's very difficult to figure out what the political sentiment is.
So on the Labor Party no confidence vote, let's be clear about how irrelevant the Labor Party is at this point in Israeli politics. They have 4 out of 120 seats in the Knesset. What they have said about the reason that they are doing this is they tweeted, "Our daughters and sons have been held captive by Hamas for 103 days, 103 days that the state of Israel is torn between Israel and Gaza, and the government doesn't care at all," echoing some of the criticism from the hostages who were released and also the families of those hostages and those who still remain in Gaza. In another post, the party said, "They don't have time, we do not have time, and there is no trust in the government that does not do everything to return them. There is no trust in a government that does not put the kidnapped as a priority, a government that cares about its own corrupt interests and not those who give their lives for it." And they ended by saying, "This is a government that cannot be trusted. It should be overthrown." So listen, the Labor Party has become fairly irrelevant in Israeli politics, but the sentiment they're expressing here is extremely common in Israeli politics. And you can see this in the incredibly low ratings for Netanyahu in particular right now. I mean, the last poll we saw, he had like a 6% approval rating. So he's been able to forestall any political consequences by saying, "Yes, I hear you. We're going to talk about it after the war." Totally. And then he says, "But by the way, the war is going to go on forever." So, their theory, his and Yoav Gallant and the rest apparently of the war cabinet's theory of the way to secure the hostage release is by continuing to bomb the hell out of the Gaza Strip. That's the way to secure the hostage release. And even many of the hostages who came back, who were furious, who thought they were going to be killed, and some of whom, by the way, were killed by Israeli forces. They said, "You have no idea what you're doing here." The only time hostages were released was through a ceasefire deal, the polar opposite of the strategy that they claim to be employing here. So, their strategy for obtaining the hostage, getting the hostages back has clearly failed at this point. But of course, they're not going to acknowledge that, because to acknowledge that would to acknowledge that there needs to be some sort of a diplomatic solution, and that would create some sort of an opportunity for a reckoning on their own failed leadership. And of course, they don't want any of that.
Bingo.
Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.